Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today at this TrueAllele user webinar. Today, what we're going to have is Lisa Schiermeier-Wood from the Virginia Department of Forensic Science is going to be talking about their experiences with implementing TrueAllele Casework.
Good afternoon, everyone. So as not to disappoint you, this is going to be more of a policy talk than a science and math talk. So if you were looking for a lot of science and math, you're not going to see it today. But I am pleased to share with you Virginia's experience with implementing TrueAllele in our casework laboratory. Today I'll talk briefly about what Virginia was doing with mixtures prior to SweepDam 2010, our unique collaboration with Cybergenetics, our training, and ultimately our implementation of TrueAllele Casework. I'll finish up by talking about our court experiences as well. Virginia was using capillary electrophoresis since 2008, and prior to that, we had been using slab gels with the SMBio instrument. We were routinely using likelihood ratios on two contributor intimate samples, and CPIs were being calculated on mixtures before we knew what a stochastic threshold was. Of course, if majors or minors could be extrapolated, a random match probability calculation would be applied. When the guidelines were released, the initial impact was the idea of a stochastic threshold. Like everyone else, we drafted a validation plan. However, our plan had to be approved by our two governing organizations, our Scientific Advisory Board and ultimately our Forensic Science Board. The guidelines also allowed for the use of a validated probabilistic modeling approach, which, while not a short-term solution for us, our technical leader looked at this and put it on our radar for future research. Once our stochastic threshold validation was completed, they were implemented for CPIs based on injection time. Our injection times routinely used are 2-second, 5-second, and 10-second injection times. Those were validated, resulting in 210, 320, and 460 RFUs respectively for the stochastic threshold. Loci with alleles below stochastic threshold were used for interpretation, but were no longer used for CPI calculations, and that's what I'll be referring to as the modified CPI calculations. We began explaining this to the courts as we made conclusions on the data developed, but we calculate statistics with allowances for information which could be missing. So now we had a stochastic threshold in accordance with SweepDam. However, we remain concerned about dropout. We're leaving out loci in the calculation that demonstrated alleles in the stochastic region, but what about loci with total undetected dropout? So for instance, if you think about a 3-contributor mixture, any loci with alleles below the stochastic threshold were not used. However, what about that same mixture with loci that demonstrated 2 or 3 visible alleles, all of which were above the stochastic threshold? Did stacking cause them to get above, or was there total dropout of a contributor? We decided to modify the modified CPI. DFS limited the use of CPI to only those profiles which have all alleles above the stochastic threshold. And knowing our experience, how often do we really have an undifferentiated mixture without any stochastic alleles? So to recap, we now have random match probabilities, we've had likelihood ratios, and now we have CPIs for mixtures with all alleles above the stochastic threshold. But in the realm of touch and wearer DNA, we're not seeing a lot of mixture profiles with all alleles above the stochastic threshold. We needed a way to calculate statistics on undifferentiated mixtures with some or all alleles below the stochastic threshold. We shopped for vendors who could calculate mixture statistics, write the reports, and testify in court. At the time in 2011, a couple vendors would calculate the statistics and report the statistics, but they would not testify. Of course, casework didn't stop during this time. Mixture profiles were continually being generated. Our interim solution was to validate, train, and implement restricted RMPs based on peak height ratios. This training was limited to a group of 4 individuals to maintain consistency in calculations. We use the calculator portion of Armed Expert for these calculations. Cybergenetics was identified as the only vendor to provide all three services in addition to assisting us with some initial validation studies. Keep in mind this was also in 2011. We entered into what is a very unique contract to build a library of analyses of 150 complex mixtures comprised both of current cases without statistics and previous cases which were issued with unmodified CPI statistics in them. Regarding those previous cases that already had CPIs issued, although the SWGDAM guidelines stated that they were not retroactive, we chose to be retroactive on those CPI cases that were going to court. So anything that had an old CPI statistic that hadn't yet gone to court and were going to court after the SWGDAM guidelines, we chose to address. At the time of the implementation of our plan, VA DFS had only been online with capillary electrophoresis for 2 years. So there was literally only 2 years of capillary electrophoresis where non-modified CPIs were calculated. So with this particular contract, reports were generated on an as-needed basis by Cybergenetics, and these analyses would also be used eventually in validation studies. As far as reporting under this contract, files were transferred between our two agencies on a secure server by the head of our IT department. And I'm sure while he thought he was doing me a favor, he now has a couple subpoenas for cases which I've had to make up with him with barbecue. Cybergenetics received our FSAs and a worksheet containing information about each case. The reporting format for Cybergenetics had previously been established by both of our agencies working together. The goal was to match the format for Cybergenetics reports to match the format used by DFS for all of our other cases. The reports were written and technically reviewed by Cybergenetics staff, and DFS conducted the administrative review, and the report was forwarded to DFS, where a cover letter was written which explained the reason for outsourcing the calculation and the process for pretrial meetings and eventual court testimony. Fees associated with pretrial meetings and court testimony were the responsibility of the individual agency. It's important to note that the cover letter stayed with the report so that when the report was filed, all interested parties had access to that letter of explanation. Approximately 80 reports were issued by Cybergenetics over the period of about 1 year. Dr. Perlin testified about 10 times to these reports, and DFS testified twice to these reports. Because of the Melendez-Diaz ruling, these later testimonies were limited to cases where the mixture in question was uncontested. For example, one of the cases that I testified in was the finding of victims' DNA underneath the suspect's fingernails. However, being that victim and suspect were husband and wife, that particular finding was not contested. At the time that I testified in those two cases for Dr. Perlin, I had already completed the TrueAllele training, which I'll discuss later. While Cybergenetics was getting mixtures from us and issuing reports, DFS individuals began training with Cybergenetics to use the TrueAllele system. Cybergenetics recommended materials which included chapters from a book, Understanding Uncertainty by Lindley, a list of articles, reviewing lectures on their website, and reading the TrueAllele system user manual. The review of the pre-training materials was completed prior to the commencement of what I'll call the orientation training. That training now is called Science and Software. In fall of 2011, the technical leader and section supervisor traveled to Pittsburgh to attend the initial training, which, as I mentioned, is now called Science and Software. After this training, we couldn't begin any in-house training or validation until we procured the software and hardware to include the TrueAllele stations and the server with the processors. Once this was done, we were able to conduct orientation training with 3 additional scientists. And it's at this point that our technical leader pulled out of the training. In selecting team members for the TrueAllele team, individuals were afforded the choice as to whether they wanted to be involved. It was not a requirement of anyone's position except for Dr. Susan Greenspoon, our research scientist. The makeup of the team was designed as such to include 3 levels of mixture experience, which added multiple dimensions to collaboration and troubleshooting. Our supervisors at DFS review most of the generated complex mixtures in the section, and our senior scientist was the one closest to the bench laboratory work, being that the supervisors don't see much of the bench anymore. For those of you who may not be aware, Virginia is a state system with 4 regional laboratories with about 55 scientists statewide. After everyone completed orientation, the group of the 4 of us completed the Operator 1 course offered by Cybergenetics. This course was comprised of 6 lessons covering simple DNA mixture problems and included the whole process of uploading files, uploading requests, processing requests, uploading additional requests, and so forth. All of this was completed using DFS equipment. We submitted our homework answers to Cybergenetics along with our results, and we waited for feedback from them. It's important to note that while we were undergoing training, we were still responsible for our day jobs. So we continued to do casework and our other supervisory duties and did the training as we were able to carve out time. Towards the end of Operator 1 training is when we began to work on our validation studies. When we had completed the Operator 1 training, we began the Operator 2 training offered by Cybergenetics. As the training went on, the DNA mixtures became more complex. Just like the Operator 1 course, the Operator 2 course consisted of 6 lessons, also included homework questions. The training was very well organized, and each lesson built on a previous one and demonstrated concepts that even this old ABO dog could follow. While concepts such as 50-50 mixtures and the value of an assumed known were easily grasped, it was one particular lesson in Operator 1 training where we evaluated a mixture profile and were expected to compare what we defined as likelihoods or fit to that of TrueAllele. Independently, 2 of us used training and experience to weight the likelihoods, whereas the other 2 split the weight among the alleles that were present. The former results were quite consistent with those of TrueAllele, while the later demonstrated the loss of information by flattening the likelihoods. I presented some similar information at the MAS meeting in 2012. While we all worked independently at our own pace and turned in our own homework, it was only afterwards that we'd meet and discuss our results and findings. This was very helpful in that we were seeing the reproducibility power of TrueAllele with 4 individuals running requests on the same mixtures. At the end of each course, each of us completed Cybergenetics comprehensive examination, which included a mixture profile and subsequent questions to answer. Because we had concurrently been conducting our own independent internal validation studies, we designed our own supplemental or reporter training to include attendance at Dr. Perlin's testimonies in the Richmond area. And no, we didn't get to travel to the UK to watch him testify over there. Attendance at the admissibility hearing in Colonial Heights, Virginia. Our admissibility hearing was called a Spencer hearing. In Virginia, we don't have Fry or Daubert, but a Spencer hearing is very akin to a Fry hearing. We also perform reanalyses of mixture profiles that were previously reported by Cybergenetics. Again, they had a whole library of 80 cases that they had reported out. We knew what those answers were, and Cybergenetics was very helpful in providing us other supplemental information from their analyses. The culmination of our training was the successful analysis of a mock case and the successful completion of an oral technical competency. Okay, switching gears, as I've mentioned previously, our validation studies were conducted simultaneously with our training. The majority of the validation was conducted by Dr. Susan Greenspoon and reviewed by myself. Cybergenetics had already completed and published the developmental validation, so our validation was internal. I will note that our validation studies were presented much more in depth in a previous webinar by Dr. Susan Greenspoon, so I'll just quickly review it. Our validation included 4 single-source profiles, challenging 2, 3, and 4-person profiles or 4-contributor mixtures. I do have to clarify that our department does not routinely interpret 4-person profiles. However, I think everyone will agree that there are very subtle differences between 3 and 4-contributor mixtures. So we wanted to ensure that we had validated TrueAllele for those 4-contributor mixtures that may masquerade as a 3-contributor mixture. Our reproducibility studies demonstrated that the same match score was achieved. Our accuracy studies demonstrated that derived mixture weights were concordant with those determined by manual methods, both input DNA and mass ratio. We also demonstrated that the match scores for single source samples were consistent with 1 over the random match probability. Our sensitivity studies demonstrated inclusion of true contributors and at what level or what mixture weight a true contributor would falsely be excluded. While that rate was under 10% of the total mixture weight, we found that with our protocols, an examiner would have issued an inconclusive result. Our specificity studies demonstrated that TrueAllele was effective in eliminating non-contributors and contrived first-degree relatives of true contributors. We did some additional studies to include challenging the system with the wrong number of contributors, assuming a wrong known contributor, with profiles demonstrating dropout, artifacts, and oversaturation. More recently, we've done some studies regarding the differential degradation function. Our validation studies were presented to our Scientific Advisory Committee and subsequently our Forensic Science Board in the spring of 2013. After their approval, they were provided and testified to during the admissibility hearing, which was held in the summer of 2013 that I alluded to before. Our validation studies, reformatted for JFS, were accepted and will be published in October of this year. In Virginia, TrueAllele itself is not used for inclusion or exclusion. That still remains the domain of the bench scientist working the case. After reviewing TrueAllele results for many of our uglier mixtures with dropout, we actually ended up modifying our interpretation guidelines such that allelic dropout is tolerated at a maximum of 3 loci for a positive association to be made. Of course, comparison of a known to a profile with 3 loci demonstrating dropout could also result in an inconclusive conclusion as well. Now with TrueAllele, we also have a mechanism to report statistics when a mixture profile results in inclusion of related individuals and a traditional RMP or a derived single source calculation cannot be used. Our TrueAllele Procedure Manual borrowed from the TrueAllele User Manual. In addition to, it also follows our validation studies. We take a very conservative approach to data review and to reporting match scores. Having seen Cybergenetics files for subpoena ducus tecums on the case files that they reported, we reflected much of the information that they included, but added what we thought would be appropriate based on our court experiences. Worksheets were created to document our assessment of the EGRAM, our analysis steps, processing results, and match scores. Our protocol is available for review online on our website. In a nutshell, the TrueAllele examiner reviews the electropherogram to determine the number of contributors and assess, based on case facts, if an assumed known or differential degradation should be considered. Because of other statistical methods available to our examiners, the majority of TrueAllele mixtures are 3 contributors. The appearance of the mixture determines the number of MCMC cycles we start with. Our protocol spells out how we evaluate the data to determine if we have acceptable runs or whether more requests need to be uploaded. It also defines the conditions for reproducibility required prior to reporting out the most conservative match score from the best fitting genotype per acceptable run. Finally, the genotype distribution is compared locus by locus to the mixture egram at the person of interest allele pairs. Okay, so maybe that wasn't such a small nutshell. We felt that it was important to provide some type of evidence that TrueAllele was determining the correct allele pairs. So for every case, we incorporate the positive control associated with the evidence. Additionally, the genotype developed for the references are compared to that reported by the scientist. In Virginia, approximately 300 cases are completed statewide per month. So we have about 55 scientists statewide. Our two largest laboratories are our central laboratory and our eastern laboratory down in Norfolk. And all together we have about 55 scientists. Let's talk about what happens to the mixture profiles which don't go through TrueAllele. At the bench examiner level, mixture deconvolutions are done prior to looking at reference samples, except of course for intimate items. The deconvoluted profiles are then compared to the reference profile and conclusions are made. Loci which cannot be deconvoluted are also used for comparison. If a comparison results in a positive association, then the type of statistic to be applied is determined. If no deconvolutions are possible, that's when a supervisor intervenes. Our statewide staff was trained on unrestricted random matches as a means to provide some form of statistic to positive associations in property cases so as not to overwhelm the TrueAllele team. We were trying to save TrueAllele specifically for persons types of crimes. When we calculate unrestricted random matches, they are only calculated at what we call breakout loci. So if we've assumed a 3-person contributor, we will only apply URMs where we see 5 or 6 alleles. If it's an assumed 2-person contributor, we'll only apply URMs where we see 3 or 4 alleles. Because of this, obviously, only a fraction of the data is used, which is why we choose not to use URMs on probative evidence in persons cases. And yes, statistics in 3-contributor mixtures for property crimes end up being 1 in 5 or 1 to 10. For all profiles, our bench scientists will try first to generate what we call a traditional statistic. And what I mean by traditional is traditional to DFS. Due to the resource-intensive nature of TrueAllele, at this point in time, it is reserved for persons-only cases. So those will be the robberies, the assaults, the rapes, and the homicides. In these cases, if a traditional statistic can't be calculated, then the mixture profile is referred to the TrueAllele team. This is our flow chart which summarizes our approach to statistics. At a bench examiner level, if they can calculate either one of those two, you can see in the green box they can report a statistic per our updated protocol. And when I say can a CPI be calculated, that is our modified CPI, meaning are all alleles above the stochastic level. Is it the most probative evidence in a person's case? And if it is the most probative evidence, then it's going to be forwarded to the TrueAllele team. If it isn't the most probative evidence in a person's case, then that is a situation where a unrestricted random match can be calculated again by the bench examiner. If it's not most probative in a person's case and a URM cannot be conducted, you'll see the red box that if it's not the most important or the most probative evidence in a person's case and we can't do any of our other statistical approaches, the mixture gets reported as the significance could not be determined using traditional approaches. No comparisons will be done at this time. It doesn't preclude us from going back to it 2 months, 5 months, 3 years down the road if that particular profile does become probative. But for the short term, our TrueAllele team could not handle a huge influx of cases. So particularly the only cases that are coming to TrueAllele right now are the cases I mentioned before, they're persons cases and where it's the most probative evidence. So if we have a victim being raped by 2 different individuals, we may get 2 different mixture profiles from that case because it's per person and per charge. So the bench examiner will report that conclusions and statistics associated with John Smith are the subject of a separate report, and then the TrueAllele team will take it from there and do the TrueAllele analysis and issue a supplemental report which contains both the conclusions that he could not be eliminated and the associated statistics. DFS has chosen the route that we did not want to put out there a conclusion and not have the statistics in the same report. So rather than have the examiner say, so-and-so cannot be eliminated, the statistics will follow, we have now decided that the conclusion will be put out there by the TrueAllele examiner. When the bench examiner and the tech reviewer and the supervisor reviewer, if it's a complex mixture, agree that a person of interest cannot be eliminated, that conclusion is documented in the case notes but is not reported since they don't have a corresponding statistic. And like I alluded to before, the TrueAllele report will reflect the conclusion and the statistics. In Virginia, we now have 16 processors, and each team member has their own mapped TrueAllele station at their workspace. Processing time is dependent on a number of variables, such as the number of contributors, the profile complexity, and the number of MCMC cycles used. Some of these conditions can be tweaked to save time. However, we're sticking with what we validated and what our experience is. So I do want to emphasize again that under Virginia's conditions, if we were to upload 5 profiles that were all 3 contributor profiles, run in triplicate, if we were to upload those on a Monday, it would be either Wednesday afternoon or Thursday until we could review those results. Additional runs, of course, might also be necessary. So under these conditions, again, 3 to 5 cases could tie up our resources for about half a week before any additional runs may be necessary. References and positive controls really take negligible processing time. Our case files are pretty thin compared to that of the bench scientist files, and we are not yet a paperless agency. So our case files contain a CD of all of the electronic data to include our FSA files, files generated by the TrueAllele process, our request files, as well as what's called TrueAllele zip file, which is a file we use very heavily in peer review, that someone else can make the zip file from the data that they have processed. They can give me the disk, I can put it in my computer, and without having to connect to any of the servers, I can look at all of the data that is present, assuming I have the viewer software. Also included in our case file are the original egrams and interpretation documentation. Like I said, we're not a paperless agency, and I in particular do like looking at the original egrams on a piece of paper so I can make notes on it. Our case files also include our manual documentation of our run conditions, the appearance of the MCMC chains, the Gilman-Rubin scores, as well as the mixture weights. We also document genotype concordance, mixture weight concordance, as well as match score reproducibility. Our case files include printouts of all of the match score tables, even from runs that we may not have used, but we also have a separate printout showing the reproducible match scores, the runs demonstrating reproducible match scores. We also have a printout that includes the locus-specific likelihood ratio results of the match that was reported. All of this information then is checked through the peer review process. The reports that we're issuing are the same format as those issued by Cybergenetics, what is now becoming 2 and 3 years ago. As with our regular reports, we put as much technical information in the method statement, that is the first paragraph you see there with the bullets, to keep the results section clean and straight to the point. Our results section is comprised of a narrative statement and a match score. And what you see in the second paragraph on the screen is what I refer to as our narrative statement. And that narrative includes what the assumption is, and it also will talk about if we use differential, if we consider differential degradation. It references, again, duplicate and reproducible analyses, and then it talks about the comparison of the inferred genotypes to the reference genotypes. Then our match statement, again, we keep simple and straightforward. Based on these results, a match between the evidence and the person is, and the match statement is, as you see there, 210 billion times more probable than a coincidental match to an unrelated black person. It's our policy that we report the statistics associated with the lowest match score of the best fitting genotype. Approximately 150 cases have been completed by DFS since we have been doing this since January of last year, so that's about a year and a half. Not all 150 of those cases are current cases. Quite a few of those cases are cases which have gone out previously, which said statistics will be the subject of a separate report. And so those cases, we are finally catching up to supplying statistics associated with those positive associations. The results, our TrueAllele results, have been admitted into state, federal, and military courts. And to date, there have been approximately 20 to 22 court testimonies, which include both Dr. Perlin's testimonies as well as DFS's testimonies. And I keep alluding to the fact that we've had one admissibility hearing in 2013, and that was the Commonwealth versus Matthew Brady. The circuit court trial is still pending. And if anyone is interested in light reading, I do have the transcript of that particular admissibility hearing. In Virginia, challenges to our DNA cases are really case dependent. It may be the most innocuous case that has a defense expert assigned to it and there's discovery and a subpoena due tecum on a case file, or it may be the more high profile cases that get all the attention and the discoveries and the defense experts assigned to them. So we really don't know on a case when we work the case or release the case how far it's going to go. The party subpoenaing the TrueAllele scientist is always offered pretrial assistance. We do try and contact, whether it's defense, whether it's prosecution, we do try and make contact with the attorney to see if they need assistance, whether that means that they want to come to the laboratory and sit down and discuss the results, whether it's a phone call. Some of the times they don't return a phone call and we end up showing up in court and trying to have some last-minute discussions, but we do supply our statistical setup questions. We let them know of all the useful materials on Cybergenetics' website, and we can also supply names of other attorneys who have used TrueAllele results in their cases. So as far as Virginia's testimony experience, we have testified to about 10 cases that we worked under our own protocols, our own validations. And the Spencer hearing, that admissibility hearing, other than that one, the challenges to TrueAllele that DFS has done have been very limited. So some of those challenges include the fact that our database is limited to 200 individuals of each reported race, and that is a challenge we have been hearing since the RFLP days, so we are quite well versed and prepared to answer those questions. Another one of the challenges that I received in court was the fact that TrueAllele is a black box, that it's new and not widely used, as well as the match scores. This was a different case. The match scores for one item were very different than the match scores for another item. And with this particular case, it was a shooting case, and the match scores for one of the items was the owner of the car on the steering wheel of the car that he drove. Now, while that was not all that probative to the case, it was necessary to do statistics on it. And as you would expect, given an owner on his own car steering wheel, it was probably most of the major contributor to that mixture. And the statistics were in the quadrillions. The other statistic in that report was the person of interest who was detected in a mixture from the back seat of the same car. So that person was more of a minor contributor to that mixture, and the likelihood ratio match scores on that were quite low. So there was a big disparity between going from quadrillion times more probable to 30 times more probable or 50 times more probable. I don't recall what the actual number is. And so that stood out to the attorney, and he asked about that quite a bit. The admissibility hearing that I keep referencing was in Colonial Heights, Virginia. It's a small little community about 45 minutes to an hour south of Richmond. And in this admissibility hearing, the bench scientist who developed the DNA profiles testified to her findings. Me as the section supervisor testified, and my testimony was elicited mainly by prosecution, talking about why we ended up going with TrueAllele, what our process was in selecting TrueAllele, which is most of what I explained to you previously. Our technical leader, our program manager, Brad Jenkins, talked about our nuclear DNA protocols and whether or not the bench scientists followed the protocols in place for our analyses. Dr. Susan Greenspoon, our research scientist, testified to the validation, which at this point in time had been previously submitted to our Forensic Science Board and Scientific Advisory Committee. We had received their approval, and so it was shortly after that approval that we were testifying at this about our validation results at this hearing. One of the big things that came up with Susan's testimony is the fact that as we were going through validation, remember our validation started somewhat after our Operator 1 training began. We were not experts at that point in time, and we were doing the best we could with the information that we had, and we made a conscious decision that our validation data would contain, our validation summary, would contain all of the data. We wanted to be very transparent with that, and we did not want to not show the runs that were unusable. We showed all of the runs. And so it's akin to a training process, any training process, where you do make mistakes in training and you learn from them. So all of this data was represented, and one of the things that the defense made a lot of issue over is the fact that there were a lot of times that the profiles had to be rerun. And of course, if we knew then what we know now, I don't think we would have that situation. But in the presentation of the data, Susan had highlighted the runs that were not used. She had highlighted them in yellow, and there was sufficient explanation given why certain runs were not used. And during closing, the defense referred to that as the sea of yellow in our validation study. Dr. Mark Perlin also testified during this admissibility hearing, and he testified for the better part of 2.5 days. And he, not having a forensic science background as I do, I thought he did a fabulous job at testimony. Just a few of the defense challenges that were presented to him during his testimony was that the source code hadn't been released. TrueAllele doesn't use thresholds. No controls are used. He is also challenged with the fact that making assumptions isn't objective. When using an assumed known, the known sample was processed first. Use of the term match. He was challenged with error rates, with dropout, with good versus bad runs, and he was challenged regarding the use of ground truth samples in his validation studies. Pretty much in our testimony so far at DFS, Dr. Susan Greenspoon has testified, I have testified, our testimony has been very basic. My testimony is typically less than 5 minutes, and it is limited to the fact that my role in this case was not to examine evidence. It was simply to calculate the statistics. The second point of the testimony is, where did I get the data? How did I get the data? And then we established what my assumptions were based on the number of contributors, whether I used an assumed known, whether differential degradation was considered, and then finally the match scores. And out of the testimonies so far, that's pretty much been the extent of the testimonies. Keep in mind, in Virginia, likelihood ratios are not new. We have testified to likelihood ratios for years and years and years. It's just now we have a different method of how we get to that likelihood ratio. Currently at DFS, we are looking at the new version of Viewer, and by new, I mean it's the 2014 version of Viewer. And in that version, the new calculation is more accurate. So we are looking at that, working with that to do some in-house checking on. And the other thing that's important to note is that, as with other methodologies, we watch what new programs are released and will evaluate them as possible complements to TrueAllele. As I talked about before, there are a number of property crimes that are being released with numbers such as 1 in 5 and 1 in 10 because they are complex mixtures that we don't have the time to address with TrueAllele. So if we can get back some of the value in those profiles and use different statistical approaches to those mixtures, we are keeping our eyes open for that possibility. There are other bells and whistles associated with TrueAllele that we are not yet validating. Okay, we spoke about the fact that in Virginia we don't routinely interpret 4 contributors, but we have validated it for up to 4 contributors. However, TrueAllele can currently handle up to 6 contributors. We have validated TrueAllele for individual evidence samples with assumed knowns or to use as a basis for ownership. In other words, we will look at a 3-contributor mixture if it's from the steering wheel of a car and we have the sample of the owner of the car. We will run the sample with 3 unknowns, and if that analysis supports the fact that we are finding the owner's DNA on the steering wheel, then we will use that as a basis for ownership and run additional runs requesting 2 unknowns plus the owner of that vehicle, using him as an assumed known. TrueAllele can do joint interpretation of multiple evidence samples. However, we don't currently do replicates, and so we have not looked at that or validated that part of the program. The operator can use TrueAllele results for nested interpretation, and we have not done any validation studies with that function either, because we limit our assumed knowns to those suggested by the evidence and/or case-specific facts. We are not making assumptions on questions that may be in the jury's purview. Okay, I would like to acknowledge the 3 other members of my TrueAllele team, Dr. Susan Greenspoon, Lee Collins, and Angie Rainey, and of course Brad Jenkins, our program manager, who keeps us on the straight and narrow. I'd also like to acknowledge the Cybergenetics staff whom we've worked most closely with, Dr. Perlin, Matt Legler, and Bill Allen. And I know there are additional staff now behind the scenes at Cybergenetics, and I'm sure it's only a matter of time before I get to know you as well. I do want to emphasize that our implementation was a group effort, not just with our own DFS staff, but with the assistance of the Cybergenetics staff as well.